Now let's turn to the supply side of the market. The supply side of the market is very similar to the demand side of the market. While some of the variables are different, and obviously we're looking at firms instead of consumers, very similar relationship, and we're still looking at things like price and quantity. So we're going to list and describe in this section the variables that influence supply. In this section, we examine the market supply. So this is the decisions of generally firms about how much of a product to provide at various prices, and we'll be looking at all the firms in the market, not just looking at like one specific firm. So in this section, we're going to stick with the market for smartwatches. Now here's the supply schedule on the left in this figure on the top part of your slide. Supply schedule, again, is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity supplied of the product. And it has the same two variables, price and quantity, as we did in the demand schedule. Although instead of being the quantity demanded, now it'll be the quantity supplied by firms. So the price of $450, firms would be willing to supply 7 million smartwatches per week in the market. At a price of $400, they'll be willing to supply 6 million smartwatches per week. $350, 5 million smartwatches per week, and so on. Again, because this isn't very intuitive, it's not easy for us to work with, we can graphically represent the supply curve. And we do that with the figure on the right. So the supply curve shows visually the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity of a product supplied. And again, we're working with the price and the quantity. The quantity supplied is the amount of a good or service that a firm is willing and able to supply at a given price. So the price of $400, firms are willing and able to supply 6 million smartwatches per week. That's the quantity supplied. The price of $300, the quantity supplied is 4 million smartwatches per week. Now, as a price, let's say this price of smartwatches is $400, firms are willing and able to supply 6 million smartwatches per week. When the price increases to $450, they're willing and able to supply 7 million smartwatches per week. So as the price of smartwatches increases, the quantity supplied increases. And this is going to be the law of supply. So more formally, it's the rule that, holding everything else constant, an increase in the price causes an increase in the quantity supplied, and a decrease in the price causes a decrease in the quantity supplied. Another way to think of the supply curve is that it's the firm's marginal cost curve. So it's going to show how much the marginal cost of producing that last unit is. So that's how much a firm is going to be willing and able to supply at that price. Obviously, a firm is not going to be willing to sell at a loss, or at least for very long, because they face that hard budget constraint. So they have to be able to get back in revenue at least as much as they're paying to create the good, to build the good. As firms increase their production, their costs are going to go up. Some of that's going to be due to labor, so you may have to hire new people or pay your workers overtime. And some of it is due to the alternate uses of those resources. So the things that can be used to produce smartwatches can also be used to make smartphones, also be used to make computers, maybe video game systems. So there's a lot of alternate uses. So when firms are trying to purchase those resources to use in production, they have to compete against other firms that are supplying other goods. So as their quantity supplied is going to increase, as they want to increase production, they're going to have to spend more money and have to bid those away from other uses. And because of that, as firms increase their production, they're going to need a higher price back. And that's why we have the supply curve with an upward slope. Now let's explore the variables that cause a shift in the supply curve. So change in something other than price, so any other variable that changes, will cause the entire supply curve to shift. So if we shift to the right from S1 to S3, that's called an increase in supply. And if we shift the supply curve to the left, so moving from S1 to S2, that's a decrease in supply. Just like for our demand curve, when the supply curve shifts, the quantity supplied is going to change even if the price doesn't change. The quantity supplied changes at every possible price. So if there's an increase in the supply curve, we shift it to the right from S1 to S3. Even if we remain at that initial price P1, the quantity supplied is going to increase. It'll increase from Q1 to Q3. Conversely, if there's a decrease in supply. So we're moving from supply curve S1 to S2. Even staying at that initial price, the quantity supplied is going to decrease from Q1 to Q2. Now in this chapter, we're going to look at 5 factors that influence the market supply. They're going to be prices of inputs, technological change, the prices of substitutes in production, number of firms in the market, and the expected future prices. So now we're going to talk about each of these in turn and explore more deeply how they affect the supply curve. First, the changes in the prices of inputs. Inputs are things used in the production of a good or a service. So using the smartwatch example, inputs include the computer processor, plastic, labor, and many other things that go into the actual producing of that smartwatch. So if you increase the price of an input, that decreases the profitability of selling the good. That causes a decrease in demand. If you decrease the price of an input, this increases the profitability of selling the good. So this will cause an increase in the supply. Next, let's look at technological change. So changing the ability of a firm to produce a given level of output with a given quantity of inputs is a technological change. And firms can experience either a positive or negative technological change. Although typically, over time, firms tend to experience positive technological change. So for example, a new, more productive variety of wheat could increase the supply of wheat. On the other hand, so that's a positive technological shock. On the other hand, let's say government restricts land usage for agriculture. This could decrease the supply of wheat. It's a negative technological shock. So if there's a positive technological shock, that's going to increase the supply curve, going to shift it to the right. So the figure on the right moving from S1 to S2. A decrease in technological change, that will shift the supply curve to the left. So on the figure on the right on the bottom, moving from S1 to S2. The next factor that causes a shift in supply is the price of related goods in production. So many firms can produce and sell alternate products. So for example, a farmer in Illinois, they could plant corn or soybeans. So if the price of soybeans rises, they can plant or end up supplying to the market less corn. Other times, two products are bundled together. So for example, cattle provide both beef and leather. So an increase in the price of beef encourages more cattle farming. So we're going to end up increasing the supply of leather. So looking at the figures on the right, the top one represents the supply of corn if the price of soybeans increases. So because that alternate product, price of that increases, that's going to shift the supply curve to the left, moving from S1 to S2. On the other hand, the figure on the right on the bottom shows what happens if there's an increase in supply of leather. So we have an increase in the price of beef and causing farmers to, raise more cows to be slaughtered for beef. That's going to increase the supply of leather. So it's going to move the supply curve from S1 to S2 out to the right. The next factor is the number of firms. So if there's more firms in the market, this will result in more of a product being available at every given price. That's going to increase the supply. So it's going to shift the supply curve to the right, in this case moving from S1 to S2. If there's fewer firms, we'll see the supply decrease. So for example, if a new firm enters the market to sell smartwatches, we're going to see the supply of smartwatches increase. And finally, we have expected future prices. So if a firm anticipates that the price of its product is going to be higher in the future, it might decrease its supply today in order to increase the supply in the future. So it'll temporarily shift the supply curve to the left, moving it from S1 to S2. So for example, in a recession, firms realize consumer incomes have decreased, they'll sell fewer smartwatches. They may wait until the recovery when people are more likely to buy them and more people will buy them. So temporarily, they'll decrease their demand, their supply, shift it to the left, and then increase the supply when they expect they'll be able to increase the prices in the future when people have, higher income, they're more able to buy smartwatches. Like we did for this first section, before we end this section, I want to focus on some terminology, the change in supply versus the change in the quantity supplied. So a change in the quantity supplied is caused by a change in the price. So if you change the price of a product being examined, this will move along the supply curve. So in the figure on the right, taking the original supply curve, moving from point A to point B. So if the price increases from $400, where the firm is willing to supply 5 million smartwatches per week, the price increases to $450, the firm will now be willing to supply 6 million smartwatches per week. So you'll move along the supply curve as the price increases. Any other change, any of these factors we talked about that affects the supply, causes the entire supply curve to shift. So let's say the price of inputs that go into producing that good, the price of those decrease. That will shift the supply curve to the right, moving from S1 to S2. So at the price of $450, we're moving from point B to point C. So the quantity supplied increases from 6 million smartwatches per week to 8 million smartwatches per week, while the price stays at $450. This is the change in supply. So remember, change in the quantity supplied, moving along the supply curve. Change in supply is moving the supply curve itself.